I want to focus in my brief time this morning in terms of the intersection between climate change adaptation and food security. And I want to do it in a particular way that in many respects is quite a simple narrative, but I think it's an important narrative to make. And that is, if we're going to understand the intersection between climate change and food security, we need to break that issue down firstly into understanding climate change through the prisms of vulnerability, adaptation, adaptive capacity and resilience. And if we break down the issue in that way, then further we can consider this issue as at core an issue of livelihoods. And it seems to me that if we understand livelihoods in the way that livelihoods relate to both the food system and the environmental systems that are potentially coming through via climate change, then we understand very much the core of the issues facing poor and vulnerable people on the planet. And when I talk about livelihoods, I'm doing it in a particularly sort of social scientific manner. There's been obviously an exhaustive sort of analysis of livelihoods, particularly since about 1990, when this became a frame of reference in much of the development studies literature. And what I'm talking about is things like diversity within households, the spatial bounding of households and communities, both locally and through non-local spaces in the globalised world that we're living in, and also particular social categories within households and communities, prisms through gender, through social classes, through landowners and non-landowners, through net food buying households, net food selling households. There's a number of different social categories we can use to understand these livelihood dilemmas. So let me start here in this brief presentation by talking about climate change and climate change adaptation. Now, I don't want to labour these points, right? But I think that the key point to make here is that the weight of current thinking on these issues builds from traditions within political ecology that suggest, in a broad sense, that intensification of environmental hazards tends to increase levels of vulnerability more aggressively for those in already more vulnerable situations. So that is, pre-existing vulnerabilities tend to beget higher propensities for a worsening vulnerability profile, particularly with respect to climate change. Now, we can see this both spatially, in terms of the poor tending to live in more environmentally vulnerable situations on riverbanks, on coastal locations, perhaps on the margins of high drought vulnerable situations, but we can also see it in terms of socio-economic cleavages within communities in the developing world. This is very much part and parcel of the argument about gender and its relevance to climate change, the fact that climate change will increase distances for water cartages, will increase the sort of household chore profiles of women who, through gendered norms, are traditionally associated with those activities. And indeed, it's already been mentioned today that migration is a potential adaptive response to climate change. We find that migration is highly gendered as well, with in general men having higher propensities to make use of migration than women. Now let's turn to food security as the sort of second prism of what I'm talking about today. Most of, particularly the populist sort of literature on food security at the present time has very much a production-centred focus. And I think that's important, but it's very different to particularly the way the FAO and many other social scientists tend to consider these issues. In a broad sense, it's a oft-made point, but a very true point, we tend to grow enough food across the planet to feed everyone. The reason we have somewhere about 900 million people on the planet who are under conditions of undernutrition is mainly to do with problems of access. And so if we start focusing on these questions of access, we start focusing on issues of entitlements, the way that poor people perhaps have limited opportunities to grow their own food because of land issues, or perhaps are unable to generate incomes to buy food on the marketplace, or in environments where government social welfare and safety net programs can't provision them with foods. So if we think of this relationship between climate change and food security, it seems to me that we break down the climate change problem as a livelihood problem, and we break down the food security problem as an access problem, and we look at the ways in which these processes intersect. So let me talk a bit more specifically in terms of food and climate change. Now, in terms of production, the broad consensus, at least in the literature to date, I think the next IPCC report will update some of this, is that the sort of consensus modelling is that climate change will have a net negative impact on the planet's ability to grow food. This is going to be very spatially varied. It's, farmers on the Canadian prairies are probably not too badly placed, but certainly for many, and farmers in North Australia, much of the debate about Australia's food security future focusing on North Australia has got at least an implicit climate change recognition in there. Production in the north to compensate from assumed drops in production in the Murray-Darling Basin and particularly in southwest Western Australia, which will be hit hard according to the climate models. But then if we try and link this to debates about food security, the key thing is that what we're going to be seeing across the world is that many of the areas in which the risk profile from climate change is going to impact most negatively in terms of food production capacity in the future is in the tropical world, and of course that's where most of the world's hungry and undernourished people are. So there's a sense of climate change, if you take my earlier point about climate change aggravating existing inequalities, when we start unpacking this dilemma, it's the farmers in Canada, the potential farmers in the sort of Siberia and the sort of high latitude places of both Europe and Asia that might generate some benefits from a warmer climate. But with the exception of a few places like North Australia that seem to be anomalies, much of the tropical world will be hit hard. So there's some quite complex and nuanced points to this debate. Now, this slide here has been taken from a recent report from the what's known as the CCAFS program, the Climate Change, Agriculture and Food Security program, which is being funded through the CGIAR network of agricultural research institutes globally. And I'm going to be referring to some of CCAF's work here rather than sort of any other work that's been happening, mainly because I think it's sort of it probably best articulates many of these arguments than any other sort of contemporary sort of research organisation is doing at the moment. And what this diagram essentially says, I apologise if you can't read it at the back, is it's a very simple point to be made, and that is that there is global environmental change relating to climate change. And there is societal change, which is sort of going on, if you like, exogenously, and there is a set of impacts which will then impact upon the food security dynamic of individual communities, households and people. So I want to think about this with particular resonance. No, in fact, I'll just move on to the next slide first and then come back to that point I was going to make. So if we and I'll just put this up to let you have a read of this while I talk over it, and then I'll come back to it. If we think about that issue of how people relate to climate change in terms of different livelihoods and vulnerabilities, and then we start saying, well, can we in some meaningful sense try and model this into the future? There's an enormous amount of uncertainty, and I'm not resiling from that whatsoever. Then we come to a framework that kind of looks something like this, and this is coming from the CCAF's recent work. What they've tried to do is to say, through various GIS methodologies, what are the kind of regions of the world that are going to be more exposed to climate change in terms of the kind of things that might impact particularly on food production. So they've developed a 9-indicator composite measure of temperature spikes, rainfall, dry period extremities based on current norms. And you could map the sort of vulnerability profiles in terms of weather changes, weather and climate changes according to various criteria based on all the kind of assumptions that we might want to question in a technical sense, but there's some broad consensus around. They then say, well, what is the sensitivity of climate change, particularly with regards to food? So you might get particular crops that have growth profiles or might be sensitive to extreme heat stress or might be sensitive to long dry periods or wet periods. Can we link the sort of the temperature sort of climate shifts that we're seeing here to the particular agronomic characteristics of certain crop systems? So, okay, well, there's a sort of a way of trying to relate this together, and it's a very imprecise science, as you can imagine. And then thirdly, what kind of characteristics of the human population can we incorporate into this kind of model? If we think of adaptive capacity, things like income, things about dependence on particular cropping systems. These kind of issues provide a basis for understanding these relationships. And then CCAF says, well, we can then think of different relationships between these variables, and obviously if you're living in a place which has got a high exposure to climate change, high sensitivity in terms of what you're cropping, and a low coping capacity, you're screwed basically. And so what they've tried to do, and I apologise a bit for the quality of this map, I've copied it from a CCAF's report and the resolution is not great, but what they do is they take most of the tropical world in this map here, Latin America, Africa and a fair bit of Asia, a bit of Indonesia's cut off for one reason or another, and through a sort of fairly crude sort of colour gradient system here, these are the areas in different combinations, right? Now, I'm not saying for a moment this is precise science, but I think it's very interesting for a point I'm going to make in a moment. And here's where I'll probably just walk over to the slide. That sort of worst case scenario of the sort of three things coming together in the sort of most negative or adverse consequences for communities is highlighted in red, red being sort of the generic alert colour. And what I want to focus on here is that big sort of slice of red, basically following the Ganges River up from sort of Pakistan through northern India. So the consensus here is, from a global scale, from a multilateral sort of research organisation scale, there's a problem in North India that's going to happen. This has been identified as having one of the worst profiles of combinations of human and environmental pressures coming from climate change. So what does this mean? And this is where I could spend an hour talking about a story, but I'm not going to. Basically what I'm going to say is this. If you think of the particular position that region holds, not just in terms of the parameters of this analysis, which is based around the local conditions, but the way in which that region is inserted within domestic and global economies, you've got major consequences, particularly for India. This is the sort of centre of the Green Revolution. In the Indian province of Punjab, which is of quite a small geographical area, I probably can't describe it in terms off the top of my head, but in the Indian region of Punjab, that region grows as much wheat annually as the whole of Australia, right? This is an incredibly lush environment that has benefited from Green Revolution technologies in the 60s and 70s to generate enough food that essentially has a critical impact in feeding particularly the rest of India. About half of the wheat crop annually is purchased by the government of India and is put into social safety net schemes for redistribution across the rest of the country. This is the sort of anchor of India's national food security program. Now, for the past decade, analysts from Vandana Shiva right down to sort of agronomists working with international research agencies are saying there is long-term yield problems in Punjab, which are posing problems. If we add the threat of climate change on the top of this, we have dramatic changes to the extent to which that region of the world is going to be able to feed the billion or so people in India, particularly the poor and hungry that depend on it. So, without sort of perhaps labouring this point more than I should, I guess this kind of leads to what I'd say is a need to sort of rethink climate change in terms of frames of livelihoods and the lives of the poor. And if we think forward to a sort of a future kind of scenario for food security and climate change in the Indian context in particular, I guess what we're seeing is a necessary set of changes that are going to happen to the way in which food security provisioning has traditionally, for the past few decades at least, occurred in that country. The kind of, if you like, the spatial dependencies of the rest of India and Punjab, the agro-technological dependencies of the rest of India and Punjab for the redistribution of surpluses back through other parts of the country, that's going to be problematic. The government of India has already recognised this and they're trying to fast-track the development of core cereal grains in other parts of the countries to reduce dependence on the northwest. So you're going to have a lot of pressures like that. That's going to force changes in cropping patterns. It's going to probably put pressure on natural resource complexes and ecologies elsewhere in the country. That's part of the national economic planning for food in India as we speak. Secondly, if the framework for supplying subsidised food staples in India starts fraying at the edges, Thanks, Rosemary. What you're going to have is an increased, I guess, reliance on the private sector. So you're going to have some sort of marketisation. Now that's, in a sense, already happening as well. There's food legislation debate occurring in India at the moment, and one of the proposals that has been flagged, particularly coming out of sort of the economic think tanks in New Delhi, is to replace what's currently a ration system with conditional cash transfers. So rather than kind of like the intervention in Aboriginal communities in Australia, where you actually give social welfare recipient households goods or dockets of Woolworths that say you can't spend it on anything but wheat and rice and whatever. Part of the argument in India is that should be liberalised and marketised in a particular way. The problem with that is that India is subject to massive food price inflation. Food prices across the board have doubled in less than a decade. So whereas you've got a subsidised sector which is hanging together and is allowing people to get the sort of necessary kilojoules in their body each day to sort of live from day to day, if you go down to the markets, the prices have been skyrocketing. And so people have become, in a sense, more dependent, certain groups of people have become more dependent on those public distributions. So you've got a problem there if the system falls over, which is going to create a whole lot of new vulnerabilities, both through urban and rural contexts. But thirdly, and this is the more important thing, is the kind of macro-scale narrative that I've just given about how national policy might shift, that will well occur, but what's really going to happen is a shift, to me, it seems to me, to different sort of livelihood adaptive strategies of people, because as you get sort of a recalibration of the food system generated, if you like, by climate change, you're going to have people's behaviour shifting around quite a lot, both in terms of sort of the adaptive strategies that households might might deploy in order to sort of inject themselves into the national economy to generate livelihoods in new kind of ways. So you're going to see an intensification and diversification of those efforts. Me, as a geographer, that's kind of what I'm interested in, basically, is the way in which these macro processes shift to community responses and household responses. And I think, coming back to my original point, if we don't understand those responses, we get certain parts of the narrative about food security and climate change, but we don't get a lot of the detail. And particularly if we're talking about understanding the lives of the most vulnerable from climate change, we have to understand those livelihood responses if we're going to sort of move forward. So I'll end with this quote here, which I'm slightly using out of context. It's from Karen O'Brien, written in 2006 from the journal Global Environmental Change. This quote comes from a paper in which she relates human security to climate change as opposed to food security, but food security in a sense is a subset of human security, so it sort of relates to the same topic. And what she says is, what does it mean to reframe environmental change as an issue of human security? The framing of an issue influences the questions that are asked, the research that is prioritised, and the solutions and policies that are proposed. To reframe environmental change as an issue of human security involves asking some very relevant questions about equity, justice, vulnerability, power relations, and in particular questions about whose security is actually threatened by environmental change. So it's that last point, whose security is threatened, is the sort of key clincher that I'd like to close on. Thank you very much.